In this video, I want to explain how you can deal with long pieces of wood and bring them to your home to work on if you don't have a truck. Now, I do have a truck, so I wouldn't be doing this procedure for myself, and I'm not going to be using the truck for any reason. It's just here to hold up the wood and the bucket. Before I get going, let me explain. This is not a mouse here on my jacket. This is what they call a dead cat. It's kind of a fuzzy thing on the top of a mic. I'm outside now, of course, and any wind makes the mic go funny. So believe it or not, fur stops that sort of thing. Anyway, we've got a piece of wood and we've got a project in mind and we've got a vehicle, maybe a small vehicle, and we have to get that wood inside. So we need to cut the wood, but we don't want or need to cut the individual parts to their final length yet. That'll happen in the shop when we can be more careful about what we're doing. Our goal now is just to get this piece of wood short enough to get in your vehicle. And we want to do it with the minimum number of cuts because, like I said, we would prefer to cut in the shop. So this board happens to be 10 feet long. Let's say I can accommodate 5 feet in my car. Even a small car can do that because you can put it in the passenger compartment. You can lay it on top of the seats or whatever. So let's aim for about a 5-foot length of wood. Now, in this case, the project I have in mind is the footstool that we're building in this particular section of the course. And I happen to know that the footstool has 3 kinds of parts. There's the top, that's 20 inches. There are the legs, those are 14 and a half. And then there's the cross piece, that's 16. So let's go and take a look here. I should mention too that you're going to have to travel with some tools. So of course there's the saw, there's a square, a pencil, and a tape measure. And the bucket too actually is important, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the main thing to keep in mind right now is that we do not want to cut anything to final length because you're in a parking lot somewhere. You just want to get this thing cut and get back home. So we want to slightly overestimate the length of the parts we need before we're determining where that cut is going to be. So the best way to do that is with the part sizes in mind, a tape measure, and a pencil. So let's go over to the board and I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing I want you to look at is the end of this board. It's almost never possible to use the very end of a board when you're making projects, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is kind of easy to see. If you come around here, you can see that there's some cracks here. There's a crack here, a whole bunch of cracks there. Let's just flip this over and take a look at the bottom. Oh yeah, look at that. The cracks extend all this way. So we don't want cracks in our woodworking project. So when we start determining, like the top goes here, the legs go here, the centerpiece goes there, when we're figuring all these things out, we have to start after the cracks because we don't want those cracks in our final wood. In fact, in this case too, there's a couple of things to pay attention to here, a couple of other things. There's a knot here. A knot is where a branch was growing out of the tree. There's nothing wrong with knots, but when they're tight like this, but you don't really want a knot right on the edge of your piece, say for the top. And why? Well, if we cut here, chances are the half of the knot that's remaining would be loose and it would fall out. So there on our footstool, we would have a semicircular trough where the half of the knot would be. And we don't want that. Another thing, look at that. That's a defect there too. Now, if we were building a project that used pieces of wood that were narrower than this, I could tolerate that. That would be no problem because later on I'd be cutting this piece of wood to width. But in this case, I'm using full width lumber for the project. There's no cutting to width. So I don't want that. I don't want that in my finished project. So now I'm starting my calculations further and further from the end of this board. And once again, look at this. If I cut it here, just to avoid the damage, well, I'm going to run into another knot. So in this case, I don't want to start my measurements until I'm clear of all that nonsense. So this, I'm afraid, will be waste. And one of the things you need to understand is that when you're working with wood, there will be waste. In fact, if you're starting from rough lumber, even high quality rough lumber, you're going to waste at least 20% of the board as you cut the pieces and put them together. Now, we're not going to be wasting 20% of this board because it's a simple project. But try as you may, you're not going to eliminate waste. I'm going to keep these small pieces for small projects. If you've got a shop with a wood stove in it or a house with a wood stove, you can use these scraps for kindling. There's all kinds of reasons to use them, but we don't want defects to enter into our work, at least not when we're dealing with fairly fine woodworking. So I'm going to start my measurements here. Just one other thing too. This is what they call the factory end of the board, which means that it came from the sawmill that way. Now, sometimes, but not always, the end is square. See, this is a combination square, and amongst other things, it's a reliable reference of 90 degrees here. So I put this on, and I mean, that's nice and square. That is perfectly acceptable in every way. So if this board were perfect right to the end, with no cracks on the end, and that's pretty rare, I would have started my measurements right there. But because we've got defects, now you understand how to avoid them, and I give you permission to waste a little bit of wood because it's unavoidable. So now it's time for the tape measure. So now it's time for us to step off the lengths of the different parts and get to that point where we're probably going to do just one cut of this board in the parking lot of the lumberyard. But we need to know where that is so it doesn't mess us up later. So let's start thinking about the top, for instance. As I said, there's the top, the legs, and the cross piece. And we know the top's 20 inches. So we're going to start from here. Now, the top, the final length of the top is 20 inches. But I have to give it more than that because remember, I want a rough cut, one rough cut in the parking lot. That's what I want. So do I give it 21.5 at this stage? I would consider that a minimum because you may have to make cuts on both sides of that top. So let's just give it 22 inches. Okay, so 22, make a mark. I don't really have to mark it with a square, but I'm going to, just so it's a little more clear for you. And in light pencil, I'm going to write top, just so I know what it is when I get back to the shop. Now, do you remember the length of the centerpiece? That's 16 inches on my plan, so let's allot 18 inches for that. So 18 inches, another line, mark it, and then fairly light so that we can erase it later. That's the cross piece. Now the legs are 14.5 each, so two of them together would be 29, and we want to add a little bit more. So we're looking at maybe 31 inches allotment for the legs. But notice what's happening here. I mean, if I do 31 inches, well, I'm almost to the end of the board for the two legs. So I don't really need to go that far over. Because remember, I just want the one cut so I can get it in my small car. So let's just see. How much can my car accommodate? I thought maybe 5 feet might be reasonable. Well, we're a little more than 5 feet here. So just under 6 feet. I think that piece of wood there, and this piece of wood too, because it's shorter, could fit in a small car. But let's say you've got a really small car and you can't fit that. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make an allotment for, let's just see what it looks like, for one leg. So 14.5 plus another couple of inches for an allowance, and that's there. So this side's certainly short enough to fit in any sort of small car, a little over 52 inches. And this side here, once again, we're almost 6 feet on this side. So it's like we're transferring the 6-footer from that side to this side. So at this stage, you have a decision to make. Can you accommodate in your vehicle a piece of wood that's a little bit shorter than 6 feet? I say you probably can. If you can't, then you could mark it here, make another cut, and have a small piece there. And you can also cut on any one of these lines, because don't forget, we've got leeway, we've got extra wood. So it's not a final cut. And chances are you're not going to be able to do a very good final cut with a handsaw in a parking lot anyway. So you have to allow for that cut to be rougher and to be redone again in the shop. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this board right here. I'm going to assume that the two pieces can fit in your vehicle. The question now becomes, how do you cut a piece of wood when you're in the parking lot of Home Depot? So let's just pretend we're in the parking lot of Home Depot right now, and I'll show you how you can go about doing that rough cut nice and efficiently. So this is where the bucket comes in. I mean, it can be anything really. You just want something to put the wood up off the ground. In fact, you could even just cut it over your knee if you want, but a bucket makes things a little bit easier. So we'll just put that here. And the saw, now this is my favorite handsaw by far. There's nothing else in the world that cuts as nicely as this. And it comes with a plastic sleeve. Keep the sleeve, because when you want to store this baby, this is going to protect the teeth. I've used this particular one for quite a while. It's not new, but it's still going to cut really well. And let's just get the wood in position. Now, as I said, this is a rough cut, so it doesn't really matter if we deviate from things. And later in the course, I'm going to be showing you a couple of tricks for cutting very accurately with a handsaw like this. But for now, we just want to get this thing small enough. So put your knee on it, give it a little bit of weight. Start the saw like this, just some really short little nibbles until you get it started. And then you're going to put some more power into it. But let me tell you about something. Take your hand away before you start applying some power. I wonder if you can still see it. About 30 years ago, I failed to do that. Got a nasty cut in my thumb right there. When I was a woodworking beginner, I left my hand there. I started cutting a lot. The saw jumped out, and a nice big fat right into my thumb. So, well, there it is. There's the scar. You can see it. Don't do that. Anyway, now, a saw like this, look closely at the teeth. See, they're pointed forward in a way, and that's why this saw cuts on the push stroke. It doesn't cut very much when you're pulling it back. The cutting happens when you're pushing it forward. So with a saw like this, you want to give it an extra oomph on the downstrokes. Now, at this stage, we got some danger coming, danger on the horizon. And the danger is if I keep cutting, the weight of this board is going to put a lot of stress on these fibers, and we're going to get a nasty break there. I don't know how far it would go, but it could extend to the point where the good part of the wood that we have would get damaged. So if you have a helper, if you have someone helping you, well, that's a piece of cake. You just have them take the weight, and then you don't have to worry about breaking that off. But if you're by yourself, you might want to just tip it down. Just take the weight a bit onto the ground, and then just... Now, I'm almost through, right? Can you see? This is wiggling now. It's almost ready to let go. And I don't want to have a bad break here, even a little bit. So I'm just going to support this with my hand. And there we go. So, that's not a bad cut, especially for the parking lot of the Home Depot. But now we've got our wood small enough that we can put in just about any small car, and we can head on home and let the real woodworking begin.